We have a great class today with, a great speaker, and I'm expecting an awful lot of information. If you if you can't sort of analyze all the information that's coming today, the class will be recorded, and you can watch it again in the recording. I'm sure that there'll be so much stuff going on. Okay, I'm Jerry Garfinkel. I'm the treasurer of the Jewish Study Center. As such, I need to tell you that most of our classes are free, but we do have expenses. So we encourage people to donate. We do not request, we do not, well, we do request, I guess, but we don't mandate or we don't suggest any particular time, the amount, whatever you feel is appropriate for you. We would appreciate donations. If you want to donate, you go to our website, www.jewishstudycenter.org, and then you can click on donate, and you can then donate from your PayPal account or from your credit card, or you can say you want to donate by check, and then the website will show you where to send your check. Okay, so that's the treasurer stuff. Now some technical things. As you all know, I believe, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this class is being recorded. After the class is over, I'm going to cut off all that stuff that happened before we actually began, and I'll post the recording on YouTube, and I'll send an email to everyone who's registered to show where the recording is. Meanwhile, everybody is muted, but we do want your comments and your questions. So please write them in the chat, address them to everyone. But sometimes your question will be answered by someone else in the chat. Same thing with comments. Let me also mention that the closed captions are on, so you can watch that if you can't understand my accent or maybe Rob Shlomo's. I think that's it. At the end of the presentation, there'll be a time for questions and answers, and our Vice President, Mindy Reiser, will handle that. She'll take questions that you put into the chat, and she'll answer some of her own questions. And it should be a nice session. Okay, so now I can introduce today's speaker, Shlomo Pereira. All right, so Shlomo, a lot of information about him is on our website. So if you want some details, go to our website. But here's the main thing. Reb Shlomo, I call him Reb Shlomo, he's a rabbi. He's from Portugal, from Lisbon. He's been in this country for about 40 years, I guess. And he got his smicha, his rabbi degree, I believe, in the 90s in Israel. And as far as being a rabbi, he is a rabbi, and he works at the Chabad, who's associated with the Chabad of Virginia, which is in Richmond, Virginia. He is the education director of the Chabad of Virginia. He is very knowledgeable. He sends out a weekly note about Jewish history, a one pager in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Very interesting stuff. And if you write to him, he'll put you on his mailing list. But besides being a rabbi, he is also a professor of economics, a distinguished professor of economics at the College of William and Mary. And he's done consulting work for the Portuguese government. He's done a lot of stuff in economics. He got his economics degree from Stanford University in California in the 80s, I think, sometime in the 80s. So that's sort of the general idea about Reb Shlomo. So now, Reb Shlomo, I'll spotlight you, and you can take over.
Okay, so let me get to the sharing. All right, so hopefully Now, everybody is seeing the PowerPoint. Okay,
I see it certainly. So I'm sure
perfect.
everybody else.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, good afternoon or good evening. It's always a delight to talk for these wonderful groups that the Jewish Studies Center puts together. And it's particularly nice to be able to give you a comprehensive overview of the Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula. And basically, what that means is that we are going to proceed at an extremely high speed because we'll be basically covering a century in 3 minutes or so on average. No, but the important thing really is try to understand the general patterns and the general ideas that were going on and that are relevant. So let's start with the most basic idea, and that is that according to our tradition, according to our understanding, the first of all, the term Sepharad comes, it's a biblical term. It's a term that is referred in the book of Obadiah. And Sepharad really means the Iberian Peninsula, what we call the Iberian Peninsula. And essentially, when we think about Sephardic Jews, we think about Jews that before the 1500s originated from the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula was an extremely important center for Judaism for quite some time, as we'll see. And so what is present day Spain and Portugal have a very glorious Jewish past. And well, things didn't always go very well, but as we'll see. But again, that's what Sephardim originally are, people that are originally from the Iberian Peninsula and their descendants. Today, especially if you think after the terrible 1490s, after that period, the Sephardim basically spread all over the world, and you end up with communities from the North Africa in the Ottoman Empire, including Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, in Western Europe, and eventually in Brazil. So we end up with communities, with the Sephardic communities all over the world. And the fact is that Sephardic Judaism was really dominant for quite some time. It may be difficult to visualize it now because that's not the case. In the Jewish world, maybe about 20-25% of the population are Sephardic. So, and it's not maybe the most visible presence, but that was certainly the case for most of Jewish history in this millennia. And it certainly, if you can think even until the 1900s and 1800s, the Sephardic influence was extremely strong. So essentially, if you want to define Sephardic from what we're going to be doing now, it's from the perspective of theology, if you want, from the perspective of how understand Judaism is pretty much the same as Ashkenazim. There are differences, but the differences are really more on customs, on cultural, the way cultural identity, actually, even the historical narratives that we associate with. And that's one of the reasons why Sephardic history is so neglected today, is because different groups relate to their own heritage, and it's naturally for the Ashkenazic majority to relate to the Ashkenazic history as opposed to the Sephardic history, although Sephardic history was dominant for quite some time. So to start this overview of the historical presence, Jewish presence of the Iberian Peninsula and the aftermath, a good place to start is with the beginning of the Common Era. So in the beginning of the Common Era, there was already a very sizable Jewish presence in the Roman Empire in general, and the Iberian Peninsula in particular. And the first few centuries really are a very interesting, they show an interesting pattern. So you have until a certain period of time, specifically until the late 400s, you have the Roman rule. Then from the 400s on, you have the rule of the barbarians, the Visigoths and the Swedes. And of course, and then ultimately, that's the beginning of Islam. But so the first 700 years, if you want, of the Common Era can be described broadly speaking the following way. Whoever was in charge of the Iberian Peninsula, they were into polytheism. And things were okay for the Jews. Then those peoples in charge of the Iberian Peninsula converted to Christianity, monotheism, and suddenly Jewish life became extremely difficult, progressively difficult. So, and this is incidentally not any, in any way, shape, or form, any criticism of any religion in particular. It's a very simple phenomenon. If you are polytheist, you deal with the Jews as just another god. And it's like if you are polytheist, the more gods, the merrier. If you have only one god, then suddenly the other guys are competition. So it's a very natural historical pattern. So you have in the beginning of the Roman rule, things go reasonably well until, again, you have basically the councils of Thessalonica and the Edict of Milan and so forth, when Christianity becomes the official language, the official religion of the Roman Empire, and things start becoming really bad for the Jewish population. Fortunately, in some way, the Visigoths, the barbarians, took over the Iberian Peninsula and the rest of the Roman Empire. And the barbarians were Arian Christians. They were not mainstream Christians. They were, well, even from a Christian perspective, they were polytheists. And in the beginning, again, the Jewish population welcomed the Visigoths. Things were reasonably well, and things went south really fast when, towards the end of the 5th century, the Visigoths converted to Catholicism, to Christianity, to mainstream Christianity. And then after that, it was a period of very harsh, increasingly harsh persecution. A lot of the things that we associate, incidentally, with the persecutions later on in the Iberian Peninsula, starting with Kol Nidre. Lots of people think that Kol Nidre comes from the period much more recent, in the 1300s, 1400s. No, actually, the Kol Nidre and those first forced conversions come from this period right here, around the 600s or so. And all of it is framed by the famous or infamous councils of Toledo. There were 17 councils of Toledo, increasingly more anti-Semitic and more anti-Jewish. It was a stage in which naturally Christianity wanted to assert itself, and by asserting itself meant to delegitimize Judaism. It is a stage in which the church was very concerned with separating from Judaism. So it's a stage where you start saying, well, Christians cannot observe Passover, cannot observe the Sabbath, Christians should not go to synagogues, and so forth. So it was a period of separation, and with this separation came a degree of persecutions and forced conversions that by the end of the 7th century, Judaism was on the verge of extinction in the Iberian Peninsula. And then who comes to the rescue? Well, Islam came to the rescue. In the year of 711, a very easy year to remember, year 711, the Arabs and the Muslims from North Africa, working for the Umayyad dynasty, that it was the ruling dynasty in the Middle East, in particular, centered around Baghdad, the armies, the Islamic armies attacked the Iberian Peninsula, and they were able to conquer virtually everything. And I say virtually everything because there was a sliver in the north of the Iberian Peninsula that they were not able to. Not sure that they were not able to. They were too busy to go into France, mostly. But be it as it may. So by the years of 711, you have the Jewish population literally welcoming the Islamic forces as liberators. They were the ones that really stopped what was a path to extinction at that stage. Now, we have to understand also that everything is relative in life. And one of the things that's important to notice is that the Umayyad dynasty from Baghdad, they were very much ahead of their time. Okay, they were very cultured. They were very progressive in all the things that you can think about. And the very fact that these Northern African invaders of the Iberian Peninsula were working on behalf of the Umayyad dynasty made a difference. Out of curiosity, also, at this stage, the armies that invaded the Iberian Peninsula were led by a general by the name Tariq, and that name was memorialized with a mountain in the southern areas of the Iberian Peninsula that is Jabal al-Tariq, which became Gibraltar. So Gibraltar is named after the leader of the Islamic armies that invaded the Iberian Peninsula. One point very, very important because of this control of the Umayyads is that the Umayyads in their main area of control was around Baghdad. That was the capital of their empire. And they were actually attacked by some Islamic extremists, and they were defeated. They had to flee. And it was a very important thing that they actually rebuilt. They rebuilt the Umayyad Caliphate in the Iberian Peninsula. So all these knowledge, all this love for poetry, or all this love for the arts, although not sculpture and other forms of art like that, but all this culture is brought to the Iberian Peninsula, and it starts to flourish, the Iberian Peninsula. Even a lot of tolerance, a lot of acceptance, if you want, of the difference was, and it made a huge difference that the Umayyads were the ones that were in charge. And the domain of the Umayyads was consolidated by the year 929, which is when the Caliphate of Cordoba was declared by a great caliph, Abdurrahman III. So great guy. Now, this marks the beginning of the golden era of the Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula. And it's a golden era because Jews were integrated in society. Jews were in very high positions. If there is any period in history in which the stereotype that we were better treated under Islam than under Christianity, there's this stereotype. The only period for which this is really true is this period. And indeed, for example, this first gentleman that we have right here, Shmuel ibn Grela, was a rabbi. This is a very interesting case of how integrated the Jewish population was. He was the vizier. The vizier means that he was the prime minister. He was second to the caliph. The vizier was the guy that was in charge of leading the Islamic armies. Okay? in any other part of Islam, they would never have a non-Muslim leading the Islamic armies. So he's leading the Islamic army, and like everybody else that leads an Islamic army, he was supposed to carry a Quran in one hand and the sword in the other. But again, this is a Jew leading the armies, and it's a well-known Jew, it was clear that he was Jewish. It was not a hidden Jew in any way. So this Shmuel ibn Grilla, actually, even before he became the vizier, he was in charge of bringing from the Ottoman, not well, what would be the Ottoman Empire, but bringing from Constantinople and other areas. He was supposed to bring the books that were in Latin and bring them to translate into Arabic. So again, the culture, the interest for culture that there was at the time, I mean, the legacy that they left includes, aside from the poetry, includes algebra. Mathematics was very much developed during this period as well. So, and Shmuel ibn Grilla, one interesting thing is that one of the main reasons why he became so popular with the vizier is because he was very good with antidotes. And at some point, apparently, the vizier, the caliph, was maybe drank some poisoned wine. And yes, they were Muslims and they were still drinking wine. And he apparently saved the day. So again, he was a doctor also, as many rabbis at the time were. So that is Shmuel ibn Grilla, sometimes Shmuel Nagid. Nagid, it means really the prince. But you have many other rabbis during this period. We're going to just name a few and then go through these that are in the PowerPoint. We have great grammarians. We have people that excelled in developing Hebrew as a language to upkeep it, the grammar, the poetry. Dunash ibn Labrat was a very, very famous one. And you have people that were people that were incredible in other fields. For example, even in Jewish law, one of the first major figures in Jewish law is Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi, originally from Fez in North Africa. He came to the Iberian Peninsula. It's a very interesting case, a very interesting story, because some things seem never change. And that is, he writes in one of his books that when he came to the Iberian Peninsula, he was in his 80s, he was a very old man already. And it says that apparently in the Iberian Peninsula, everybody wanted to hire a rabbi with a lot of experience and under the age of 40, which is a phenomenon we see today, but apparently it existed back then as well. So you have other people like the Ibn Ezra's, the Ibn Ezra's family, Ibn Migash, a great teacher eventually of Maimonides. But let me tell you just a little bit about these three that I chose to share a few things with you. So Shlomo ibn Gabirol, this is absolutely fascinating case. Aside from being a great poet and a great philosopher, he wrote a book by the name of Mekor Chaim, The Source of Life. What is fascinating about this book is that this book circulated until the 1900s. Until 1900s, this book circulated in the Latin version. Nobody knew about the Hebrew version, and in fact, until the 1900s, early 1900s, people thought that this was a Christian scholar that wrote that book called Fons Vitae. Fons Vitae. And it was a philosophical treaty that was extremely influential in Christianity. But everybody thought it was attributed to Aviceron, that was supposed to be a Christian philosopher. Until in the Geniza in Cairo, it was discovered a very early manuscript of the book in Hebrew. And now we know it's accepted by everybody that the Fons Vitae is the source of light. Mekor Chaim is a contribution of Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Gabirol. So aside from everything else, we discovered that a little bit over 100 years ago. Rabbi Yehuda Levi, what can we say about Rabbi Yehuda Levi? This is probably one of the earliest cases of the lovers of Tzion. He was a poet, he was a philosopher as well. He wrote famously the Kuzari, the book of the Kuzari, where you have different positions arguing about the correctness of Judaism. But more importantly, from our perspective, he wrote poetry, love poetry for Zion, for the land of Israel. He very famous in his ode to Zion. He says that my heart is on the east, but my body is on the west. How can I be happy? And towards the end of his life, well, turned out to be toward the end of his life, he actually made the trip to Israel, and he settled very briefly in Israel. And according to the legend, in 1141, he was trampled to death by some marauders at the doors of the walls of Jerusalem. Well, we don't know how much of this is true, but the point is that it's known that he left and he put his actions where his words were. He went to Zion. Incidentally, some of Israeli, very famous Israeli song is inspired in some of his poetry. The Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, very, very famous song from Naomi Shemer, is inspired by his poetry, quotes parts of his poetry. So Maimonides, what do we have to say about Maimonides? Maimonides is maybe the greatest person, the greatest Jewish scholar ever. He was a product of Spain, although of the Iberian Peninsula, although he actually didn't live in the Iberian Peninsula for very long, for reasons that we're going to see in just a moment. At the age of his bar mitzvah, he had to flee. We'll see a little bit more about that in a second, but again, he's the product of this environment. He's the philosopher by excellence, he's the rationalist by excellence, he's the Aristotelian, he's everything. And in addition to being all of these, he was a very innovative physician, and he was an incredible, very proficient and very prolific writer in matters of Jewish law. The amount of stuff that he wrote is just absolutely mind-boggling. And I mean, to the point that he wrote in Arabic, actually, most of the things, not everything, but most of it. He wrote in Arabic, exception being the Mishneh Torah, the Code of Jewish Law that he wrote in an updated version of Mishnaic Hebrew. But everything else was in Arabic, and they actually have a whole family of translators, the Ibn Tibun family, some of them living in the Iberian Peninsula, some in Provence. That's what they did. It was translating his books and his works from Arabic into Latin and into other languages, vernacular languages. We could spend the rest of the day talking about Maimonides. It's enough to say that he was eventually, he actually visited the land of Israel. He went to the land of Israel. He was expecting to settle in the land of Israel. He ended up not being able to, but he writes about his visit to the land of Israel with his brother. We also know that in the voyage to the land of Israel, that there was a um, very serious storm in the Mediterranean, as there are today. I mean, you remember famously the American pier that was built in the beginning of this horrible situation in Eretz Israel. It was destroyed by the storm. So there was a very big storm that almost destroyed the boat where Maimonides was going. And he was saved. And the day that he arrived in the land of Israel, he proclaimed that day as a sort of a Purim Katan, as a very special day of celebration for his family. And from what I know, it's still observed to this day. So anyway, so the Golden Era, you have an incredible number of contributions, and unfortunately, the Golden Era started losing a little bit of its luster in the beginning of the 1100s. So let's say around 1145, 1150. And this is because something happened in the Iberian Peninsula, or I should say two things happened in the Iberian Peninsula that they were extremely consequential. The Iberian Peninsula became the front line between Christianity and Islam. Pretty much like I believe that the Middle East is now the front line between Christianity and Islam. Not getting into that, but certainly the Iberian Peninsula was that, the front line. And so what you have is in the beginning of the 1100s, of course, that's the beginning of the Crusades. And a lot of the Crusades, when they were going to the land of Israel, their final destination, some of them went by land, very famously, all the havoc that they wreaked on the Jewish communities, all the blood and whatever in France and Germany, what is now France and Germany. But what is less known is the idea that a lot of the Crusades went by sea. And going by sea from Northern Europe, you have to go around the Iberian Peninsula. So you have to go around this edge of the Iberian Peninsula, this northern part and here. And that explains, for example, why the north of the Iberian Peninsula was never really conquered by Islam. There was always a little bit of a pocket there that was helped by the Christians from Northern Europe. But more importantly, a lot of the Portuguese expansion, against the Muslims, meaning this way south, was helped directly by the presence of the Crusades. The Crusades were coming this way. They need to resupply, and they were basically hired to, in exchange for being able to take whatever they want, the spoils of the war. They were hired to help. And that was true, for example, with the conquest of Lisbon. They were true with conquest of Santarém and other places around along the coast. So the first thing that we have that is creating a big problem for the Jewish communities is the inflow from the north of the effectively what were a very fanatic group of Christians, militant, military, belligerent group of Christians that basically they wanted to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims, but they wanted to liberate the Holy Land. They wanted to liberate this land here as well, and Jews were caught in the middle of all of this. So a very problematic issue, and you can see that there is an expansion. There is a very fast expansion. we don't need to get into that all that much, but it's enough to say that even the origins of countries like Portugal and Leon, the Kingdom of Leon when it existed, and Portugal, this is the aftermath of the Crusades. That's the Crusader nobles that settled in the area. They acquired the right to settle there because they were helping with Reconquista, so to speak. But as we can see, is that very fast that you have a lot of liberated territories, so to speak, liberated by the Christians, the different kingdoms already by the 1200s. The other thing that happened that was even worse was that while the Jewish population was being squeezed from the north, they ended up being squeezed from the south as well. Why? Because the Umayyads that were so illuminated and so great, they were invaded by a bunch of Islamic fundamentalists. One of the biggest first waves of Islamic fundamentalists, these Almohads that came from the North Africa, that had a very interesting take on a lot of things, that claimed to have discovered some of the writings of the Prophet that nobody else knew. And basically, they went on a rampage on jihad, not only against the infidels, but against the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula that they thought were a bunch of well, certainly not frum enough, if you want to use Jewish terminology for this. So, and these Almohads, they invaded from the south and they destroyed completely the incredible presence, Jewish presence and Islamic presence in places like Sevilla and Cordoba and other places. They just destroyed everything. So what was the golden age for Al-Andalus, for Islam, and it was the golden age for Judaism, was basically eradicated by this squeezing of Christian fanatics related to the Crusades from the north and the Almohads from the south. And that means that the Jewish presence now is a little bit in each one of them, in each one of the areas, the Christian area, the Muslim areas. But at this stage, because the Almohad Caliphate, because of their fanaticism, the Islamic fanaticism, they could not tolerate Jews or Catholics or Christians for that matter, but certainly they could not tolerate Jews. And so the Jewish presence in the Almohad Caliphate was not that strong anymore. And this is what is referred to typically as the Silver Age of Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula. So Judaism was still very strong, naturally, in places like, again, Castile, Navarra, and the Kingdom of Aragon that covered places like Barcelona and Girona and Tortosa, and places that were very strong for quite some time, Jewish presence. And even in Castile, you have lots of very strong very strong presence, Jewish presence. I mean, to say, places like Toledo, namely. So what that means is that because of the condition, there were no longer conditions for such a wonderful, calm, relaxed, and such a conducive to all types of innovation and all types of friendly relationship. That was not there anymore. But it was still a very productive period from a Jewish perspective. Now, before I'll tell you a little bit about Nachmanides, let me just tell you about few very important rabbis with great contributions from this period. Rabbi Abraham Abulafia. It's incredible contributions in terms of Jewish mysticism. Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher. Yaakov ben Asher, it's an incredible case because he wrote the Arba Turim. He wrote what would become the basis for the Shulchan Aruch, that is the code of Jewish law that is followed or not followed, but it's the reference to Jewish observance to this day by Rabbi Yosef Karo. And the work of Rabbi Yosef Karo is based on the work of Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, to the point of not just following the different parts, but different chapters and different paragraphs even. So it's very much, it's an incredible contribution, and it is a particularly important contribution from many perspectives, because Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, he was actually original from Germany, and he had to flee Germany when there was, again, lots of persecutions, as it was the case. And his father and his siblings, several of his siblings, his father was the great Rosh, the great Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, the great Rosh, with great commentaries on the Talmud and so forth. And he had to run, he had to flee to the Iberian Peninsula. His father and some of his siblings lived in Toledo. Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher ended up spending most of his time in Barcelona and apparently learning with Nachmanides. But the reason why this is so important is because this is the first time that we have a little bit of a merger of Sephardic and Ashkenazic philosophy and Jewish law and so forth. So it was a very momentous period from that perspective. You have the great rabbis, great leaders, como Rabbi Hasdai ben Kreskas, the very famous Jewish leader. And for those that are interested, there is what I think it's a very beautiful, although painful, but very beautiful Spanish series on Netflix that it's called The Heirs to the Land. Heirs to the Land, and that series covers part of this period and features a lot Rabbi Kreskas. Most of the stuff that is portrayed is actually not accurate, but it's a very interesting and moving depiction of what the Jews were suffering through this period already. Rabbi Nissin of Gerona, Rabbi Shlomo ibn Naderet, it was a major rabbi from Barcelona. If you go to Barcelona today, you still have the museum, just a museum dedicated to his works in the Jewish quarters. He is the person that we know in Judaism that wrote the largest number of rabbinic responsa, meaning answering questions on matters of Jewish law. There are now online from Tel Aviv University and Bar Ilan at least 6,000 pieces of his replies to halachic questions. You have Rabbi Yonah Gerondi, a major mystic also in ethical. And of course, you have Rabbi Moshe de Leon. And Rabbi Moshe de Leon is the one that made available for the masses the Zohar. So all of this is coming from this period that is a silver age period. Now, I left Nachmanides for the end because arguably Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, also referred to as the Ramban with an N at the end, he was arguably the most important rabbi of this period, and he managed really being a man of peace, being a physician, being a scholar. He spent most of his life embroiled in controversies because that was the nature of the times. He was very much involved in the arguments over Rambam, over Maimonides. This was a period in the Jewish world where there were basically two camps. You have mostly the Sephardic world and what would be the Ashkenazic world, assuming very different positions. Some thinking that Maimonides was too much of a philosopher, too much of a rationalist, and basically shouldn't be studied, so attacking Maimonides. And then there were other groups that were supporting a lot of what Maimonides had written and so forth. And Nachmanides was somewhere in the middle, trying to to have everybody happy. And you know what happens when you try to get everybody happy is you end up not making anybody happy. But so he was very much in the core of this controversy, of the Maimonides controversy, and there is no way of telling you how faithful and how damaging it was in the Jewish world, this controversy. Again, originating, of course, in the Iberian Peninsula, all these generations, these generations of rabbis, both in the Iberian Peninsula and in France, and they provided excuses for massive burnings of the Talmud. One of the parts of this Maimonidean controversy, the group against Maimonides, had the unfortunate idea to request the church to burn the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, which they did, but they used the opportunity to burn everything else. So to the point that some of the people that initiated all of these, they felt so bad that they ended up going to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel on purpose, to Tiberia, to in person apologize in the grave of Maimonides for what they had done. Rabbi Nissin of Gerondi being, Yonah of Gerondi being one of them. So anyway, Nachmanides also got embroiled in a very difficult controversy, the so-called disputation of Barcelona. This was it's starting to be very fashionable at that time, mostly in the polemics against Judaism. The Christian clerics discovered that there was a whole body of literature, Midrashim and the Talmud and so forth, that help shape what Judaism is. Until that point, they had been basically battling Jews based on the Torah exclusively and on Tanakh, on the Hebrew Bible. And they didn't realize that there was a whole body of literature around. Now, how did they realize that at this stage? Mostly because there was a number of people relatively knowledgeable, Pablo Cristiano being one of them, was a Jew. He was actually a student of Nachmanides for a while, and he converted and he became a fanatic Catholic, which, well, that's the way it worked. So basically, he was able to convince the king of Aragon, Jaume, James. He was able to convince the king to set up a disputation of Barcelona. And this was a little nasty, although, I mean, basically, Nachmanides was questioned. He was leading the disputation. He was the part of the Jewish part. He didn't have an option. This was not a disputation. It was a little bit of a trial, because the point was to try to prove that Judaism was wrong. But it's enough to say, and the disputation of Barcelona in and of itself is a fascinating event, but it's enough to say that for all reckonings, Nachmanides managed to win this disputation, which was very unique. And King Jaume, in his own record of the disputation, very famously wrote about Nachmanides that never anybody that was so wrong was able to put forth such good arguments. Okay, never anybody so wrong as Nachmanides was able to put such good arguments forward. So maybe an indirect way of saying that Nachmanides actually won the day. Be it as it may, in the aftermath of the disputation, he was basically forced to leave Spain, and he ended up going to the land of Israel. He made Aliyah, he went to the land of Israel, and he started basically rebuilding the community in Jerusalem, and then he went to Akko, where he joined forces with Rabbi Yechiel of Paris and started the yeshiva. But that's already another story. Okay, so that's this period of the Silver Age. Now, things uh, things got really, really, really bad after this. The 1400s were horrible. It was a horrible period for the Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula. It was the beginning of a very fast decline. And what happens? Well, officially, if you want, the 15th century started in 1391, because 1391 is still the 14th century. But the changes start around that time. The infamous massacres of 1391 were the turning point of Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula. For 4 months or so, starting in the summer of 1391, the mobs of Christian fanatics, basically stirred by um, some radical monks, the Dominican monks, they just went on a rampage, starting in Seville and going throughout a good part of Castile and Aragon, but not Navarra or Portugal, but Castile and Aragon mostly. And it's enough to say that the Jewish population of the Iberian Peninsula was estimated around this time, so we're talking about late 1300s, the estimate was that was around 600,000 people. 600,000, so more than 500,000. That was the estimate. Of that, about 100,000 were killed. About 100,000, broadly speaking, were converted by force. And about 100,000, give or take, were expelled. So the Jewish population was officially in half a year, if you want, was reduced in half. With all the consequences of that. So, of course, people being expelled is one thing, people being killed is another thing, and then people being converted by force was not a joke. It was not a joke, because you're talking about a very large number of people, some converted more willingly than others, but the overwhelming majority was converted under duress. And this was not inconsequential. This was very fatal. It was a turning point, not only from the perspective of how much of an negative impact it had on the Jewish population right away, but also because it created within the Jewish people three groups at least that were the source of lots of problems as time went by. So first of all, you have the Jews, the 300,000 or so Jews that were left. Then you have a large number of conversos, and I'm talking about people that converted, and some of them just say, what the heck? Well, let's just call it quits and be whatever we can be. We don't need to be very Catholic or very Christian, but let's stop being Jewish. So not necessarily enthusiastic, but they adopted Christianity for good. And then you had a sizable number of people that were the so-called Anusim of Marranos, or whatever you want to call, that were people that were trying still to keep some Judaism in one way or another, but in secret, because they had to be officially Christians and so forth. But that's the beginning of that phenomenon. And it was a very traumatic period. Aside from everything that you're talking about, and all the massacres and forced conversions, a very traumatic period for Judaism, for Jewish life, because you have families that are torn apart. You have families that part of the family was converted and the other part was not converted. They were still family. They still wanted to get together. They were family, sometimes husband and wives, sometimes parents and children. So this was an excruciatingly difficult period from that perspective, but also was a very difficult period because it led to a transformation of anti-Semitism in those parts of the Iberian Peninsula that would end up leading to the final, to the expulsions and so forth. What was it? Was the fact that Judaism stopped being perceived mostly as a religion, but start being perceived mostly as a race. So it's the purity of blood laws and all that approach that changed. And why is that the case? Because we have a situation in which the people that were converted by force, most of them didn't know the first thing about Christianity. They were obviously not good Christians. Even the ones that wanted to be, most of them were not good Christians because they didn't know anything about it. But as Christians now, they didn't have any restrictions to access all the professions, everything. They could be everything, like all the other Christians. So they were very successful. They were very successful in everything. They were even very successful as Christian clergy. There was an enormous penetration of these conversos in the Christian clergy. I mean, some of them very willingly, some of them very, very sadly and very famously, but even at a sort of a lower level of enthusiasm. So the idea is, okay, so these Jews, now they are not Jews, they are Christians, but they still associate with the Jews. They still trying to do Jewish things. And so they now just benefit from all the blessings that the system gives the Christians, but they are not good Christians. So they are opportunists, very opportunistic. They are benefiting the opportunities. They are insincere. They are all the bad things that you can think about because they are not good Christians and they are benefiting from everything. Of course, this is a perverted way of looking at things, but this led to conclusion, well, once a Jew, always a Jew. So, and these will have a lot of influence, again, in all this legislation that was introduced of the purity of blood. And of course, it culminated with the expulsion, as we'll see in just a moment. There was, just mentioning very briefly, there was an episode, the disputation of Tortosa in 1413, 1414, that was absolutely horrible event. This was something that was orchestrated against the Jewish people, and at this time the Jewish people was very depleted in terms of leadership and everything. And you have literally thousands of clergy arguing against 20, 30 Jewish representatives. And this was a power play in the context, the historical context of the papacy, the famous papacy of Avignon. For those of us familiar with that part of history, this is a stage in which there was not just one pope, there were actually two popes and at some point three popes. So there was a period of fragmentation. And all the different popes were doing different things to show that they were the most important. And the Pope of Avignon is just on the French border with Catalonia and so forth. So it's right there. The Pope of Avignon was actually Spanish. And the Pope of Avignon was present at these Gregory, and he is the one that basically led the proceedings against them. So this ended up, again, with a lot of more forced convergence and so forth. And naturally, this then leads to the beginning of the Inquisition and leads to the beginning of the auto de fe, the burnings of heretics in public. And keep in mind that the Inquisition actually had jurisdiction over lapsed Christians, not Jews. They did not persecute Jews per se. They persecute Jews that were officially Christians and were not good Christians to their judgment. So these, again, the 400s was one piece of legislation after the other. And things came to a horrible outcome when by 1492, the very Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, they together now, Aragon and Castile together, they were able to expel the Muslims from Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula. So it was the end of the Caliphate of Granada, and it was the end of Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula. It was 7 centuries, almost 8 centuries. But that was the end of the presence of the Islamic presence. A couple of very brief footnotes on these. The first is that the same people, a lot of the same people that refer to Judea and Samaria as occupied territories also refer to the Iberian Peninsula as occupied territories. It's important to know that there is a certain view in Islam, that's not the only view, but there is a certain view that inspires all those horrible movements, that any piece of real estate in the world that was ever under Islamic control is by definition occupied territory, and all Muslims have an obligation of defensive jihad against those infidels and recover those areas. But again, that's just one parenthesis. Now, the conquista of Granada and the expulsion of the Muslims created an interesting situation because, well, now that we don't have any more Muslim power, maybe it's a good time to get rid of the Jews as well. And here we have to understand something, is that a lot of the military campaign against Granada, against what was left of the caliphate, a lot of the campaign was financed by Jewish money. And this was one of those situations in history where, unfortunately, not the only situation, it was a glaring situation in which the best way to get rid of the debts was to get rid of your creditors. So the best way to get rid of the debts was to get rid of the Jews. That was a major motivation behind the whole thing. And with the decree of expulsion that occurs immediately after, in March, so barely 2 months after the Conquista of Granada, that is edited, it's promulgated, the decree of expulsion. And here what you have is a very careful process of really getting an inventory of the Jewish property, and all the debts to the Jews will revert to the crown, and so forth. So there is a very systematic way of appropriating, if you want, the property that would be abandoned. And so we have, by August of 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from, we say usually from Spain, effectively was the expulsion of the Jews from Castile and Aragon. The Jews were not expelled from Navarra, that was one of the other kingdoms, and they were not expelled from Portugal. And as a matter of fact, many Jews went many of the Spanish refugees went to Portugal. The expulsion was around the 9th day of the month of Av. That is Tisha B'Av. It's a very sad day, of course, in the Jewish calendar. It's one of the most solemn fasts. And according to the Spanish Chronicles, the rabbis saw the refugees that were leaving Spain and taking whatever they could take with them, which was very little. They saw people so desperate that they mandated that on that day that people should sing and should play instruments and should try to, in some way, lift up their spirits on Tisha B'Av. Now, two things here to mention. The first is that a lot of the refugees, not all of them, of course, but a lot of the refugees went to Portugal. The estimate is that there are at least maybe 150,000 that went to Portugal. And it's understandable because Portugal had a reputation of being reasonably tolerant about the Jews. Portugal was not part of any of the massacres that we mentioned before. There was no Inquisition in Portugal until way later than this. So it was an natural place to be. But what that means is that when it comes to 1492, the Jewish population of Portugal now is enormous. The Jewish population of Portugal it's maybe around 200,000 Jews in a population of a little bit over 1 million. So the Jewish population of Portugal in 1492, if you count domestic Jews plus the refugees from Spain, it was humongous. It was 15% of the population, almost 20% of the population. So it's not small by any reckoning, and it was not small from a qualitative perspective. All the sages, the great Spanish minds that existed at that time, they fled to Portugal. The Rabbi Aboab, the famous Rabbi Aboab, Rabbi Abraham Saba, the Caro family, with Itzhak Caro, and then Yosef Caro was already born after. So this
Reb Shlomo, I'm giving you the 5-minute alarm that we want to end around 2:15.
Okay. Done. Thank you. So, okay. So there is no way of minimizing the magnitude of the disaster that represented the expulsion from Spain, and then eventually what would happen in Portugal. So we'll get to that in just a moment. So Jews have been expelled from Spain. In the Iberian Peninsula, you still have a huge presence in Portugal. And what happens in Portugal now? Well, in Portugal, what happens is that because of a number of political considerations, the crown desperately needed to keep as many Jews as possible, but also had to get rid of them. In the process of getting into marriage agreements with the Spanish crowns, namely with the crown of Castile and Aragon, part of the conditions was to expel the Jews. And on the other hand, they were in the middle of the beginning of the discoveries, and a lot of the scientists at that time in Portugal were Jewish. The head mathematician and astronomer was Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, was one of the most influential people in the discoveries at the time, and discoveries as I referred to. Another big astronomer was Joseph Vizinho, and again, a very strong presence in financially and in terms of the scientific contributions. So the crown did not want to expel the Jews, and the solution that they found was to convert the Jews by force. So while in Spain you actually have a decree of expulsion and Jews were expelled, in Portugal you have a decree of expulsion of 1496, in December of 1496. But what happens is that immediately the Jewish population was dismantled. All the organizations were dismantled, all the property confiscated, and you have a succession of episodes of forced conversions that led to, culminated in October of 1497 so you have thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews that were converted by force. And uniquely, they were given a period of 30 years to adjust to the new faith. So they were given a grace period of 30 years. And uniquely also, they were forbidden to leave. Notice that the whole idea is to keep the Jews there, except that now not as Jews, but as new Christians. So you have thousands upon thousands of Jews, even from noble families, from the Zacuto family, from the Abravanel family, from the Saba family, from the Caro family. You have massive conversions, and people are allowed to sort of slowly grow into their new religion, and they were not allowed to leave. And what that means is that there are two main ramifications, if you want, of of these events, because by 1497, this is the end of organized Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula. It's the end of Sephardic Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula. It's the beginning of lots of other things, but it's the end. There is no more organized Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula. And this creates it's a new era for Sephardic Judaism, because it creates, on one hand, a Sephardic diaspora. The Jews that were expelled from Portugal and Spain, from the Iberian Peninsula, and the ones that managed to leave Portugal, to flee Portugal after the forced conversions, they initially went in most to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, but then eventually they ended up going more to places like England and Holland. Eventually they made it to what is referred to as Latin America, South America. In particular, in the 1600s, as main movements already of Sephardim from Holland, in particular, to Brazil. And it's these refugees, that's a fascinating story in and of itself. It's the descendants of these refugees that are the first Jews that settled in North America. The first 23 Jews that settled permanently in North America were Portuguese and Spanish Sephardic refugees from northern Brazil. And they went from northern Brazil to New Amsterdam, is now New York. And they arrived a little bit before Rosh Hashanah of 1654. But again, that's the whole diaspora that was created. So in a way, if you want, you can think about this period of catastrophic ending of Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula as the beginning of lots of communities throughout the Ottoman Empire, including the land of Israel. It was a major revival of Judaism in the land of Israel in the 1500s. And you go to North Africa, and then eventually places like even Germany and Holland and South America and North America. So it was an end, but that end multiplied into lots of beginnings. So it's a growing diaspora. There is also something very consequential, which is what I call, using modern terminology, a growing dysphoria. Dysphoria is people that are one thing in their hearts and have to show something else, which is you have a humongous contingent of people that were converted by force. And in most cases, they have no interest whatsoever in becoming Christians. They didn't know anything about Christianity. And they were able, in the case of Portugal, that was a very unique case, they were given initially this period of 30 years to adjust to their new religion, which was a golden period, so to speak, to develop some hidden forms of Judaism, develop some adaptations of Judaism that allow you to do Jewish things while openly you were Christian. So the birth of massive crypto-Judaism, hidden Judaism, originates at this point, because lots of the things that were more open, from having Jewish names to circumcision to observance of Shabbat and things like that, of course, all of that had to disappear. But there were other things that were kept in the family, kept in secret, and so forth. But as time goes by, as generation goes after generation, of course, the Judaism that you're practicing is becoming more distorted. And when it comes, I mean, to what, a couple of centuries after, it's barely recognizable as such. And the Jewish world was affected enormously by these, not just with the new diaspora, but this new dysphoria, because you have large communities all over the place that are made of the so-called penitents, that are people that were conversos that wanted to come back to Judaism. And in the beginning was relatively easy. As time went by, it became a little bit more difficult. And this has been an enormous source of pain for lots of people throughout the centuries, this idea of trying to reintegrate into the Jewish community and not how to do that, how to be able to reintegrate into the Jewish community. And basically the point is, well, that's again a big discussion in and of itself, but the point is, for the Jewish communities outside of the Iberian Peninsula, the big question was, were these people victims, or are they traitors? Were these people that just took the easy way out, or people that were forced? Because it's one thing to be forced to convert, but it's another thing to stay after you were forced to convert. Of course, you were forced to stay, but people could leave. So you can argue, well, you're forced to convert, but then you just leave and live your life as a Jew somewhere else. Okay, if you want to save your life, that's fine. You convert if you have to, you pretend. But then if you stay there for the next generation or 2 generations, you're not staying for good reasons. You're staying because you want to keep your properties, keep your whatever. So now you're what? A victim or a traitor? So
I think we have to close up at some point,
yes,
Shlomo. I mean, it's very interesting.
Wrapping it up now. So we have, again, all these Sephardic congregations, again, that are in some way related to that from Israel, France, United States, Latin America, and so forth. And maybe the best way to end, literally, is to say that in some way, sort of, both Portugal and Spain, that are the 2 countries in the Iberian Peninsula now, they came to recognize the historical, call it mistakes, the historical wrongdoings, and in one way or another apologizing to the Jewish community, and in one way or another introducing legislation. We are talking now about 2015, introducing legislation that would give citizenship to the descendant of the Sephardim that were expelled. It was sort of closing a circle, sort of. As it turns out, in both cases, it's not obvious that these led to good outcomes or not. I mean, it's mixed in some way, but you can see that in Spain, for example, you have 36,000 people, 36,000 that were given Spanish citizenship. And in the case of Portugal, the Portuguese law was much more lenient, and there were about 75,000 people that were given Portuguese citizenship under this law of return. So it was a little bit of closing the circle. To conclude, the ripple effects of the end of Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula, organized Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula, were enormous. Not only lots of communities that started all over the place, but also this growing dysphoria of crypto-Judaism, which is becoming extremely important again today. For many reasons, maybe you can talk about that some other time, there is a very large number of people that want to reconnect with that inheritance, that Jewish past, now as we speak. So we still are suffering the ripple effects of the end of the Migraxei Castilla, the exile from Castile. And now I am done.
For now, at least.
No. I mean, I'm done with ready for questions.
Okay. Mindy, do you want to take over for questions?
A bit. Rabbi Pereira, I don't need to tell you that was an extraordinary presentation. There was so much there. I think some of us will listen to the recording at least 2 times, but probably 3 or 4. I don't want to ask grand questions. We really don't have the time, and you can't possibly have the energy, or maybe you do. And one of those grand questions would
Trust me.
All right. One of those grand questions will be, in Hebrew, it's al regel echad, on one foot. You talked about the convergence in at least parts of the shared tradition of Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and you gave us an extraordinary look at the men of enormous genius and multiple talents. And I can't ask you to summarize that, But if you were to distill the teachings of these extraordinary men, would there be one theme or one overall approach that could be?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. So there is, let's see if I can be, forgive me. Okay, there we go. So there is a main difference between traditional Sephardic approach to things and Ashkenazi. And that is reflected in the contributions of all these people that we talked about. And that is, in the Ashkenazic world, by and large, most of Jewish life was separated, was segregated, was isolated. The interaction between the Jewish population and the rest of the population was always antagonic. You don't have any historical episodes of anything. Nice. Quite the opposite. In the Sephardic world was not like that. So you have for quite some time, even in many circles, to the moment of the expulsion and to the moment of forced conversions in Portugal, that the Jewish population, they were pretty much integrated. I mean, keep in mind that when there was the decree of expulsion of Spain, one of the major financiers of the Spanish crown was the Abravanel family. They were court Jews, not in the bad sense of the word. They were court Jews, and they fought mightily not to try to bribe the king and the queen not to expel the Jews. But I mean, up to that point, they were that integrated. In Portugal, when the decree of expulsion is enacted, at that moment, the chief astronomer of the chief mathematician is Rabbi Abraham Zacuto. So these are communities that were used to be integrated. They were not, I mean, they were not marginalized as we understand them to be. Furthermore, all these communities in the Iberian Peninsula, they had a lot of autonomy. They have their own laws, systems of law, their own courts, their own everything. That was part of the way of thinking about the law system at the time. Okay, a different conversation. So what is the implication of this? Is that Sephardim were always much more cosmopolitan. Sephardim were always much more into general learning. This idea that you can only learn Judaism and you cannot learn secular studies, let's call it that. It's something that there were some people in the Sephardic world that argued against it, but the overwhelming majority of the Sephardic world embraced it. So you don't have anything in the Ashkenazic world that resembles a Maimonides writing about Aristotelian philosophy. Okay? To give you an idea how that even the impact that it has today, to this day, well, not to this day, but until recently, the rabbis, the big rabbis, Sephardic rabbis of 1700s, 1800s, even some in the 1900s, in the big Sephardic areas, like in Amsterdam or in London and so forth, to be able to, okay, is the absence of my spotlight meaning that I should finish?
I've just been trying to change it. Can you undo your screen sharing?
Done.
Okay,
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, so the main point is that in these communities, for you to become a rabbi of the community, you not only have to be versed in Jewish law, obviously, but you have to be versed also in philosophy, in general culture. Why? Because you're going to interact with the other people, and you don't want to look stupid or ignorant, right? So there was always a much more cosmopolitan approach, always a much less stringent approach that reflects itself in many different things, right? Sephardim can have kitniot, can have beans and even rice to a certain extent on Passover. Sephardim men use the tzitzit inside, not outside. So there are all types of things where Jewish law was much more lenient under Sephardic rule. Now, I should say that this is what historic Sephardic approach is. Forgive me to phrase it that way, but unfortunately that's becoming very different because in many ways Sephardic Judaism has been hijacked by the Ashkenazic approach. And it's very easy to understand. I mean, if you have a position that is very lenient and the other people start calling you that you're not frum enough, you're not religious enough, so the tendency is a little bit different today, but even historically, that was not the case. It was a much more lenient approach to things, much more cosmopolitan approach, much more open. Always the idea, incidentally, Sephardic rabbis, most of their historical time, Sephardic rabbis didn't make a living as rabbis. That was not proper. I mean, you make a living with a profession and you work as a rabbi as well, but that's not how you make a living. You're not a professional rabbi, so to speak. You're a rabbi because the community recognizes you as such or whatever. But so it's very, very different, very much more open in all the different ways that you can think. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have to be so active and so proactive about talking about the Sephardic heritage, is because, in my humble judgment, we need, and I'm talking about traditional Judaism, we need a little bit less of an uptight approach to things. And the Sephardic Judaism is a very traditional, very strong, very everything, and yet very open, very lenient, very... Okay, I'll just tell you one thing because, again, we could be here forever, but keep in mind the following. The phenomenon of Reform and conservative, liberal Judaism is an Ashkenazic phenomenon, not a Sephardic phenomenon. Why? For a very simple reason. Sephardim never had the need to break the dishes, because within the Sephardic world, there was a lot of live and let live. Okay? Now, if you have a system that is so strict that doesn't allow a lot of things inside, then you have to break the dishes and do something outside. You didn't need that in the Sephardic Judaism. Okay, so you could eat kosher. You drive to synagogue. That's fine. Whatever you want. I mean, the synagogue itself is going to be super duper traditional. What you do outside of the synagogue, it's up to you. That was the live and let live approach. That was the traditional, and I think we need a lot of that. Anyway, I'll finish here.
I hope we can stay at least a few minutes more, and people who have to go will go. I want to at least pull out a few things. One, where did people congregate to read the Torah? What was the equivalent of synagogue or a place in the Catholics? They had the church and you had the mosque. What did the Jews have over the span of centuries as a communal gathering place?
Well, you had the synagogues, the Beit HaKnesset. The synagogues actually historically tended to be a little bit different than what we understand now. I mean, especially if you come from an Ashkenazi background, you tend to think about synagogue very small places, the shtibel, the small synagogues. The Sephardic synagogues were very large synagogues. I mean, think about the El Tránsito synagogue in Toledo. It is a huge place. I mean, it's what we think about today when we think about the size of cathedrals. That's the big synagogues. Why? Because people used to live in relatively close areas. Not that they were separated by design, but there were Jewish quarters, and in Jewish quarters, everybody had a big synagogue where they went to. So yes, there were a lot of large synagogues. There were, of course, small ones, but there were large synagogues, um, and outside of the big concentrations, it was a little bit different. You have a little bit smaller synagogues, but keep in mind that in 1497, when the first conversions occurred in Portugal, just in Portugal, there were over 100 Jewish communities that were officially recognized by the crown. Okay, this is legal communities that were recognized by the crown. That means that they had their judges that were sanctioned by the crown and so forth. They were official Jewish communities. And so you have a very large number of everything. You have a very large number of other institutions, teaching institutions, hospitals, cemeteries, and all of that. But in particular, there was the Beit HaKnesset. There was the big synagogue, much bigger than what we have now.
Okay, one or two more questions to give you some breathing time here. In terms of the teaching of the younger generations, and we're talking here over centuries, is there anything you want to pull out in terms of how the traditions, the Torah, the Talmud, were communicated to the next generations? And we're talking here about to young men exclusively, yes?
No, not really. I mean, that's that is a world in and of itself.
Yes, yes.
But so from what I understand, and let me use the opportunity, and unless I'm already confused, but I don't think I am, the next talk that I will have with the Jewish Study Center, it's going to be in March, right? Beginning of March.
March 2nd.
Okay, and it's going to be about Dona Gracia Nasi. Okay, this is a Sephardic woman from Portugal, from Spain. It's a Sephardic woman that was a major business person. And it was a case of an incredible personality, a female personality in a male-dominated world, and not just Jewish world. So, and of course, March is Women's Month, and we want to, I mean, for me, it's very important to talk about this case because it's still not a very well-known case. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, I think the big take from in terms of the next generation was this idea that, again, people were supposed to be very, very knowledgeable about Judaism, but that didn't come at the cost of being very good in other things. You needed to know the vernacular languages. You need to know philosophy. You could excel in poetry, and so it's a very multifaceted mode of expression, if you want. As for example, with music, very famous, lots of Jewish music and cuisine and everything. So there are lots of modes of expression of Judaism yes, they are religious, but they transcend the religion aspect of things. And when you think about religion itself, I think the historical contribution of Sephardic Judaism, not necessarily what you observe today, but the historical contribution was to have a form of Judaism that was at the same time very traditional and very open. And again, the examples that we think about is I'm talking about the Abravanel family. I talk about the Zakuta family. These are families that were in the top of their fields, finance or science, and yet they were great rabbis as well. So it's this idea of being able to put together the best of both worlds, which incidentally, that's the model. It took some time for the Ashkenazic world to warm up to that model. Rabbi Hirschfeld from Frankfurt was one of the first ones in the 1800s that started advocating that. And you have, for example, today, the whole philosophy of Yeshiva University. It's an Ashkenazic influence, yes, but that is the Sephardic notion. You learn Torah, but you learn Mada, you learn the sciences. So that's the...
Okay. As you pointed out, Rav Shlomo, this could go on the entire day and we wouldn't leave, but I think we will think about other opportunities. We're offering some more classes with you, and some of the many questions that have been posed on the chat, we simply can't get into now. I think this has whetted our appetites to learn more, and I know that's something that you wish to do, and you've done it. And thank you again. It's been an extraordinary introduction for most of us to a world we barely knew.
So I suggest anyone that has questions, maybe when you send out the email to people with the link, maybe you can put my email address as well. It's shlomo@chabadava.org. And I'll be delighted to answer questions. And maybe some other time we can just get together and answer questions. Okay, please.
Okay, we'll do that. Let me make some comments. You're mentioning about the Sephardic tradition of the synagogue being sort of the large meeting place. So, in more modern times, Mordechai Kaplan, who was one of the most innovative rabbis of the 20th century, sort of tried to convert conservative synagogues into JCCs, where everybody would be, doing things like sometimes you have gyms even in a synagogue and all kinds of things. So some of these ideas from Sephardic traditions are permeating a little bit into our Ashkenazi culture.
Absolutely. Still, I think there is so much to be learned from. It's a different Jewish experience, if you want to put it that way, and I think it can serve us a lot today, because you can. I mean, I don't want to make it personal, obviously, but in a way, what I'm saying is that you can look like me and still be a scientist and still be, embracing it. You don't have to exclude the world around you.
That's true. But on the other hand, we have two hands. The Haredi tradition, or at least the Hasidic tradition, which you're kind of part of in some sense, at least in their religious prayer stuff, base it largely on the Sephardic prayer tradition. Not completely, but largely so.
Misconception. But yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of influences of the Sephardim on non-Sephardic Jewish authority.
For sure. And one of the things that is one of the most ignored, and we must bring that to the forefront because of reasons that we'll see, is before Zionism started, as we understand it today in Eastern Europe, there were several, in the beginning of 1800s, several rabbis that set the stage, several Sephardic rabbis that were proto-Zionist, if you want to call it. But a lot of the ideas were already written by those Sephardic rabbis from Morocco, from Sarajevo and other places. And that sort of brings a different narrative to Zionism being something that started in Eastern Europe. Actually, it started way before as this type of movement. And a lot of these rabbis, for example, one of the rabbis that wrote these was a Moroccan rabbi that immigrated to Israel, and his name was Rabbi Yehuda Bibas. Bibas. Okay, does the name sound? Yes, of course it sounds. Another rabbi that immigrated with lots of these important news was Rabbi Sharabi. Sharabi, does that remind us of something? Of course it does. These are names, Sephardic names that made Eretz Israel what it is today to a large extent. But again, conversation for another time.
Yeah, another time, exactly. I was pretty amazed at all the things that you have taught us today. And also, I was disappointed that, we ran out of time, basically, to go into more current things. We are trying to have a larger class, a class of a number of sessions to go more deeply into Sephardic history, because most of us who come from the Ashkenazi tradition know very little about the Sephardic history and tradition. And I think, certainly speaking for myself, it would be great to know more. So we'll see whether we can do it. And as you mentioned, I also put into the chat earlier than that we will have a class on Doña Garcia Nasi on March 2nd, also on Sunday at 1 o'clock. So people around the Atlantic Ocean, the Americas and Europe and Israel can all come to watch it in person, in some sense, live, and then also be recorded. So I thank you again, Rabbi Shlomo. We'll
My
see
pleasure.
you again in a few weeks, and I hope to see many of you also. Let me just make a couple mentions about future classes. On Wednesday, it'll be the beginning of Tisha B'Av, and Tu B'Shvat. What am I doing? Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of Trees, and we're going to have a Kabbalistic Seder that will be co-sponsored by the Jewish Study Center and some other groups. And the week after that, we'll have an introduction to Kabbalah. And then the week after that, well, about 3 weeks later, on the 26th, we're going to have our annual Latka Hamantash debate, which will be hybrid. It'll be at Adas Israel in person, and it also will be on Zoom. I will say, though, that if you go to Adas Israel, the synagogue in Washington, we'll have latkes and hamantash and other things, and we'll have to charge a little food fee because it's a big expense to buy all the food. But it'll still be free on Zoom. We don't want to charge tuition, but we do have to get our food expenses paid. Then the week after that, less than a week after that, would be Rab Shlomo's talk about Doña Garcia Nasi on Sunday the 2nd. And then the following Wednesday, there'd be a talk about the Viennese Jews entitled Leopoldstadt, Great Theater, Poor History, the study of Vietnamese Jews, simulation, and Jewish identity. And we'll have other classes that are in preparation now. So anyway, I hope to see many of you in the weeks that follow. And thank you again, Rabbi Shlomo. And also thank you, Mindy, for the great questions. I want to thank Brucha Laster for helping to monitor the gallery and also to admit people when I was preoccupied with other things. Thank you very much, and we'll see you. We'll see you, Rab Shlomo, in a few weeks, and we'll see a lot of the people here in the coming days.
Shalom, shalom.
And I will also look through the chat. There's interesting things in the chat I haven't had a chance to really examine closely, and I may send aspects of that to people in the email also. I don't want to post it to. I'm not sure I want to post it, but I may send it to people when I send the email out. Okay. Bye bye, everyone. Shvuto.